The city pulsed with life, its streets alive with the clatter of horse hooves, the rhythmic creak of wooden carts, and the chatter of a bustling populace. Gas lamps flickered in the encroaching twilight, casting long shadows of cobblestones slick with the evening's drizzle. Ethan adjusted his coat collar against the chill, his dark eyes scanning the vibrant chaos of the marketplace. He had no reason to be there that night, save for a restless tug in his chest that urged him to walk these streets, a pull he couldn't explain. Claire, on the other hand, knew exactly why she was there. Her fingers tightened around the basket of herbs she'd collected for her ailing mother. The day had been long, her patience stretched thin by sharp words from her employer and the weight of the world on her young shoulders. Yet something had whispered to her not to take the usual shortcut home, to linger in the open square just a bit longer. And so, she stood beneath the awning of a vendor's stall, trying to decide if her instincts were guiding her or if she was simply delaying another night of quiet despair. Their worlds collided in an instant, a glance across the crowded market that ignited a fire neither of them could explain. Ethan's gaze locked with Claire's, and for a moment, the noise of the city faded. Her green eyes, luminous even in the dim light, seemed to pierce through the veneer of his carefully controlled exterior, as if they could see the dreams and fears he kept hidden from the world. Claire felt her breath hitch. The intensity in his expression was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was as if he knew her, as if he had been searching for her all his life. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. Ethan began moving toward her, his steps swift and determined. Claire felt frozen in place, her heartbeat thundering in her ears as this stranger approached. When he stopped just a breath away, she tilted her chin up to meet his gaze fully. Up close, his features were sharper, more defined, his presence overwhelming. "Forgive me," Ethan murmured, his voice deep and steady. "But I feel as though I've known you forever." The words sounded absurd, even to him, yet they felt undeniably true. Claire blinked, her lips parting in surprise. Her instinct screamed at her to laugh, to brush off this strange encounter, yet the warmth in his eyes silenced her doubts. I don't know you," she managed, though her voice lacked conviction. "Not yet," Ethan replied, his lips quirking into the faintest smile. "But I'd like to." From that moment, their lives became an intricate dance of passion and discovery. Ethan, a man of sharp wit and ambition, had always prided himself on his self-control. Yet with Claire, his composure unraveled. Every touch, every shared glance, ignited a fire within him that he couldn't extinguish. For Claire, who had spent much of her life in the shadows of duty and expectation, Ethan's presence was a revelation. He made her feel seen, cherished in a way she had never imagined possible. Their love grew quickly, fiercely, defying the conventions of their time. Society raised its eyebrows at their whirlwind romance, but Ethan and Claire cared little for the whispers. They met in secret at first, their stolen moments filled with feverish kisses and whispered confessions beneath the moonlight. Ethan's hands would cradle her face as if she were something precious, while Claire's fingers traced the lines of his jaw, memorizing every detail. Their connection was electric, an undeniable force that drew them together no matter the obstacles. One night, Ethan took Claire to a secluded garden on the edge of the city, a place he had discovered as a boy. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the stars above seemed to shine brighter in the quiet darkness. Ethan led her to a stone bench beneath an ancient oak, his hands never leaving hers. "Claire," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion, "I've lived my life chasing goals, building a future I thought would bring me happiness. But none of it means anything without you." Claire's breath caught as he dropped to one knee, his dark eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know what twist of fate brought you into my life, but I'll spend every day of it proving that you belong in my heart. Marry me, Claire. Let me spend eternity loving you." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to find the words. Ethan rose, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, a promise sealed beneath the stars. In that moment, the world faded away, leaving only the two of them and the love that burned between them. But fate, cruel and capricious, had other plans. Their bliss was short-lived. Ethan's business dealings had earned him powerful enemies, and one fateful night, his life was violently taken. Claire's world shattered the moment she saw his lifeless body. The grief was all-consuming, a void that threatened to swallow her whole. She screamed his name into the night, begging for a miracle, for some way to bring him back. But the universe remained silent, its only answer the cold, unyielding truth. Days turned to weeks, and the vibrant woman who had laughed and danced with Ethan became a shadow of herself. Claire wandered the streets where they had once walked together, her fingers clutching the locket he had given her, her heart aching with every beat. Yet, even in her darkest moments, she felt the faintest flicker of hope, a whisper in her soul that Ethan was not truly gone. Their love had transcended time and space once before. Deep in her heart, Claire believed it could do so again. The city had changed, or perhaps it was Claire who no longer recognized it. Towering glass buildings replaced the ornate facades she had once admired, and the cobblestone streets she had walked hand in hand with Ethan were now paved in cold, unyielding asphalt. The rhythm of the modern world felt harsh, relentless, and unforgiving. Claire wandered these unfamiliar streets with a heart weighed down by loss, her soul aching with the absence of a love she had been certain would endure forever. It had been months since Ethan's death, though time felt irrelevant now, an endless stretch of days blurred by grief. The apartment she rented in the city's older quarter was sparse and hollow, its walls echoing with memories she desperately clung to. His scent lingered faintly on the wool coat she refused to hang in the closet, and his voice haunted her dreams, a bittersweet reminder of the man she had lost. She tried to fill the void with motion. She walked the streets aimlessly, hoping to stumble upon a sign, a connection, anything to ground her in a world that had grown unrecognizable. Yet each day ended the same, with Claire returning to the quiet solitude of her apartment, her body weary but her heart no closer to healing. One evening, as twilight bathed the city in hues of violet and gold, Claire found herself drawn to the edge of the park. A light drizzle had begun to fall, the rain cool against her skin as she wandered beneath the canopy of ancient trees. Her thoughts were a jumble of memories and longing, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, but seeing only flashes of Ethan's smile, the way his hand had felt in hers, the warmth of his embrace. She didn't notice the dog at first. It appeared as if from nowhere, a sleek, golden-furred creature with piercing amber eyes that shone like embers in the dim light. The dog stood motionless in the middle of the path, its gaze locked on Claire. She stopped, startled, her breath catching as she met its intense stare. "Where did you come from?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, but something in its posture felt familiar, almost human. It tilted its head slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Claire felt the strangest sensation wash over her, a warmth in her chest, a spark of recognition she couldn't explain. The animal took a step forward, and then another, its movements deliberate and calm. Claire instinctively crouched, holding out a hand. The dog approached her cautiously, sniffing her fingers before nuzzling its wet nose into her palm. Its fur was soft, warm despite the rain, and Claire felt an unexpected comfort in the simple connection. "You don't have a collar," she murmured, running her fingers through the thick fur on its neck. "Are you lost too?" The words hung in the air, a quiet confession she hadn't meant to voice. She expected the dog to pull away, to bound off into the night, but instead, it pressed closer, leaning in into her touch with an almost deliberate tenderness. For the first time in months, Claire felt a flicker of something other than sorrow. She stood, brushing rain from her coat, and the dog followed her movements with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It stayed by her side as she made her way back to the apartment, its presence oddly reassuring. Inside, Claire toweled off the dog's damp fur and offered it a bowl of water. It drank eagerly, then curled up on the rug near the window, its golden eyes watching her with an unsettling awareness. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was more than it seemed, though she chastised herself for entertaining such a ridiculous thought. Days turned into weeks, and the dog, whom she named Ekko, became her constant companion. It followed her everywhere, its unwavering loyalty a balm to her aching soul. Ekko seemed to understand her in a way no one else ever had, responding to her moods with uncanny precision. When she cried, its head would rest on her lap, its amber eyes filled with a sympathy that felt almost human. Claire began to speak to Ekko as if it were Ethan, pouring out her heart in moments of solitude. She told the dog about her dreams, her fears, the memories of Ethan that haunted her every waking moment. She whispered confessions she had never dared speak aloud, secrets she had only ever shared with Ethan. And Ekko listened, always watching her with that same unyielding intensity. One evening, as they sat together on the worn sofa, Claire ran her fingers through Ekko's fur and sighed. "You remind me of him, you know," she said softly. "It's silly, but sometimes I feel like he's still here, watching over me. Like maybe you're part of him." Ekko's ears twitched, and for a brief moment Claire thought she saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes, as if it understood exactly what she had said. Her breath caught, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't name. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against Ekko's. "You're all I have now," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't leave me too." The dog's warm breath brushed against her cheek, and in that moment Claire felt a connection so profound it brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't love in the way she had known it with Ethan, but it was love nonetheless, raw, powerful, and undeniable. Ekko had become her anchor, her solace, and though she couldn't explain it, she felt certain that their bond was something extraordinary. Claire began to see the world differently through Ekko's presence. The colors seemed brighter, the air lighter, as if the dog's companionship had rekindled a spark of hope within her. She smiled more often, even laughed on occasion, and though the ache of loss still lingered, it no longer consumed her. Yet, even as she found solace in Ekko's presence, a question lingered in the back of her mind, a question she couldn't ignore. Was it possible that Ekko was more than just a dog? The idea seemed ludicrous, but the way it looked at her, the way it seemed to understand her every word, made her wonder if perhaps Ethan's spirit had found a way back to her after all. The thought both comforted and unsettled her, and as she drifted to sleep each night with Ekko curled at her side, she found herself whispering a quiet plea to the universe. "Ethan," she would murmur, her voice barely audible. "If you're still here, if you're with me, give me a sign." And though the silence that followed was absolute, the warmth of Ekko's presence was answer enough. The days blurred into weeks, and Claire found herself growing more attached to Ekko than she had ever thought possible. At first, the golden-furred dog had simply been a comforting presence, a steady reminder that life could still hold warmth, even in the shadow of grief. But over time, the peculiarities began to pile up, subtle things at first, like how Ekko seemed to know exactly when she needed him most. When nightmares woke her in the dead of night, she would find him already at her bedside, his amber eyes watching her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Claire couldn't pinpoint when the oddities turned into something undeniable. It was 1,000 little moments that built upon each other until she could no longer ignore them. Like the time she lost one of Ethan's cufflinks, the last piece of him she had kept close, and Ekko led her unerringly to where it had slipped between the couch cushions. Or how, on the nights when she lit a candle for Ethan, Ekko would sit beside her, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame as if he, too, were mourning. One evening, after an especially long day at work, Claire returned home to find Ekko sitting in the center of the living room, an old photo album resting at his paws. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized it, a collection of memories from her brief, beautiful time with Ethan. She hadn't opened it in months, unable to face the pain of seeing his face smiling back at her. Yet here it was, carefully pulled from the shelf, as if Ekko had known it was time. "You found this?" she asked, her voice trembling as she sank to her knees in front of him. Ekko tilted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers with that same unnerving awareness. For a moment she almost expected him to speak. Instead, he nudged the album toward her with his nose, then rested his chin on her knee as she hesitantly opened the cover. Page after page, Claire revisited the life she had shared with Ethan. The laughter, the love, the stolen moments that had seemed so fleeting but were now etched into her memory with painful clarity. And through it all, Ekko stayed by her side, his presence grounding her as she cried, laughed, and finally let herself feel the weight of everything she had lost. It was after that night that Claire began to see Ekko in a new light. There was something about him, something she couldn't explain but could no longer deny. The way he watched her with those piercing eyes, the way his head would tilt just so when she spoke to him, as if he understood every word. It was more than intuition, it was as if he carried a piece of Ethan's soul, a fragment of the man she had loved so fiercely and lost so tragically. One afternoon, as the late autumn sun filtered through the window, Claire sat on the floor with Ekko, her fingers idly running through his thick fur. "You're not just a dog, are you?" she whispered, her voice soft but laden with emotion. "You're something more." Ekko's ears perked up, and for a fleeting moment, Claire could have sworn his expression shifted, an almost imperceptible sadness flickering in his eyes. The room felt heavy, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Her heart pounded as she leaned closer, her hands trembling as they cupped his face. "If you're him. If you're Ethan," her voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please just tell me, show me. I don't care how impossible it sounds, I just need to know." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the city outside. Ekko didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the warmth in his gaze spoke volumes. Claire felt her breath catch as an overwhelming sense of familiarity washed over her, a feeling so strong it left her dizzy. It was as if she were looking into Ethan's eyes, feeling his presence as clearly as if he were sitting in front of her. That night, the dreams began. They were vivid, more real than anything she had ever experienced, and each one brought her closer to the truth she was too afraid to admit. In her dreams, she was no longer alone. Ethan was there, his touch as warm and familiar as it had been in life, his voice a soothing balm to her frayed soul. "I never left you," he whispered in one dream, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "I couldn't. Not when you needed me." Claire woke with tears streaming down her face. Ekko curled up at her side. She buried her face in his fur, her heart aching with both love and confusion. The dreams continued, each one more intense than the last. In them, Ethan's presence felt so tangible, so alive, that she began to dread waking up. It was in the dreams that she felt whole, complete, as if the universe had granted her one last chance to be with the man she loved. But the line between dreams and reality began to blur. Ekko's behavior grew more peculiar, more deliberate. He would bring her objects that had once belonged to Ethan, things she hadn't seen in years. A watch she thought she'd lost, a book Ethan had always read before bed. Each discovery left her breathless, her mind reeling with questions she couldn't answer. One night, as a thunderstorm raged outside, Claire sat on the couch with Ekko at her feet. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across the room, and the sound of rain against the windows was almost hypnotic. She stroked Ekko's fur absently, her thoughts a tangled web of hope and disbelief. "You're him, aren't you?" she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how or why, but you're Ethan." For a moment, the room felt impossibly still. Ekko lifted his head, his amber eyes locking with hers, and Claire felt a jolt of something electric pass between them. It was as if the air itself had shifted, the boundary between their worlds growing thinner, more fragile. And then, in a moment that defied all logic, she felt it, a warmth, a presence, something so unmistakably Ethan that it brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't just in Ekko's gaze, it was in the air around her, in the way her heart seemed to recognize his soul. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Ekko's fur, and for a fleeting moment she felt as if she were touching Ethan himself. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I don't care. I don't care how impossible it is, I just want you with me." Ekko pressed closer, his body warm against hers, and Claire closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely. It didn't matter if the world would call her crazy, if no one else would believe her. In her heart, she knew the truth: Ethan had found a way back to her, even if it wasn't in the form she had expected. Their connection deepened with each passing day, a bond that transcended the physical. Claire found herself speaking to Ekko as she had once spoken to Ethan, her words flowing freely as if the dog were her confessor or anchor. And though Ekko couldn't respond with words, his presence was answer enough. In his eyes she saw understanding, in his actions she felt love. It was a love that defied explanation, a connection so profound it left her breathless. And though the world around her remained unchanged, Claire knew that her reality had shifted in ways she could never fully comprehend. In Ekko she had found not just solace but a piece of Ethan, a love that refused to die, a bond that transcended time, space, and even the boundaries of life itself. The night the veil between worlds began to thin, Claire felt it before she saw it. The air in her small apartment grew heavy, electric, as if charged by an unseen storm. Outside, the rain fell in a relentless torrent, hammering against the windows with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, a heartbeat echoing through the walls. Ekko lay at her feet, his golden eyes open and alert, watching her every movement with an intensity that had become his hallmark. Claire sat cross-legged on the floor, a tattered photograph of Ethan clutched in her hands. It was one of her favorites, him laughing in the golden glow of summer, his dark hair tousled by the wind. She had looked at it countless times, tracing the lines of his face, searching for answers she couldn't put into words. Tonight, however, the photo felt heavier, more significant, as if it held some secret she was finally ready to uncover. The candles flickered, their flames dancing erratically as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. Claire's breath caught, her chest tightening with an unease she couldn't shake. She glanced at Ekko, who had risen to his feet, his body tense and his ears pinned back. He let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound she had never heard from him before. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Ekko didn't respond, of course, but his gaze darted to the far corner of the room, where shadows pooled unnaturally, darker and deeper than they should have been. The air seemed to pulse, the subtle vibration that hummed against her skin. Claire's heart raced as she stood, clutching the photograph to her chest. And then she saw it. A shimmer in the shadows, like ripples on the surface of a pond. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with each passing moment, the edges of reality bending and warping before her eyes. The room seemed to expand and contract, the walls breathing in time with the rhythm of the rain. Claire took a step back, her legs trembling beneath her. "Ethan," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. The shimmer grew brighter, the shadows pulling apart to reveal a doorway, a faint, ethereal glow that beckoned her forward. Ekko moved to her side, his body pressed against her leg, his presence grounding her as she stared into the unknown. "I must be dreaming," Claire murmured, though the weight of the moment told her otherwise. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the edge of the light. It was warm, alive, pulsing with an energy that sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could think better of it, she stepped forward, crossing the threshold. The world around her shifted instantly, the apartment fading away as she was enveloped in a cascade of light. It was blinding, all-consuming, and for a moment she felt as though she were floating, weightless and untethered. When the light faded, Claire found herself standing in a place that defied explanation. It was a dreamscape, a realm where the rules of reality no longer applied. The air shimmered with iridescent hues, the ground beneath her feet soft and yielding like moss. Trees with glowing, crystalline leaves towered above her, their branches stretching toward a sky that rippled like silk. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something else, something familiar that made her heart ache with longing. "Claire." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it struck her like a thunderclap. She spun around, her breath catching as she saw him standing a few feet away. Ethan. He was as she remembered him, broad-shouldered and strong, his dark hair falling messily across his forehead. His eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, locked onto hers with a mixture of longing and sorrow. Claire's knees nearly gave out as tears streamed down her face. "Ethan," she choked, her voice breaking. "Is it really you?" He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if afraid to break the fragile moment between them. "It's me," he said softly. "I've been waiting for you." Claire didn't think. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms. The sensation of his embrace was overwhelming, the warmth of his body, the strength of his arms around her. It was real, impossibly real, and she clung to him as if letting go would shatter the illusion. "I thought I'd lost you," she sobbed, her face buried in his chest. "I thought you were gone forever." Ethan pressed his lips to her hair, his touch gentle but urgent, as if he, too, was afraid of losing her again. "I never left," he murmured. "Not really. I've been here waiting for the moment you could find me." Claire pulled back just enough to look up at him, her hands trembling as they cupped his face. "But how? How is this possible?" Ethan's expression grew somber, his gaze searching hers. "It's hard to explain," he said. "This place. It's a bridge between worlds, a place where souls can linger. When I died, I couldn't move on. I couldn't leave you. Her heart ached at his words, the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on her. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what to say." "Say you still love me," he said, his voice trembling. "Say you haven't forgotten." Claire's answer was a kiss, desperate, fiery, and filled with all the love she had been holding back for so long. Ethan responded in kind, his hands tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer. The world around them seemed to pulse with their connection, the air vibrating with an energy that was both wild and tender. Time lost all meaning as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, their love defying the boundaries of life and death. Claire felt as though she had been made whole again, her soul fused with his in a way that words could never capture. But as the moments stretched on, a quiet realization crept into her mind. This place, this moment couldn't last. The ethereal beauty of the realm was fragile, fleeting, and she could feel its edges beginning to fray. Ethan seemed to sense it too. He pulled back, his hands resting on her shoulders as he looked at her with a mixture of love and regret. "You can't stay here," he said quietly. "Not yet." "No," Claire said, shaking her head. "I won't leave you. I can't." "You have to," Ethan insisted, his voice firm but filled with sorrow. "Your place is in the world of the living, Claire. You have so much left to do. So much life left to live." Tears streamed down her face as she clung to him. "But what about us?" she whispered. "What about our love?" Ethan smiled, a bittersweet expression that broke her heart. "Our love is eternal," he said. "It's what brought you here, and it's what will keep us connected, no matter where we are. I'll always be with you, Claire. Always." The light around them began to fade, the dreamscape dissolving into a cascade of shimmering particles. Claire felt herself being pulled away, her body growing lighter as the world around her disintegrated. "No," she cried, reaching for Ethan as he began to disappear. "Remember me," he said, his voice a soft echo. "And remember that I love you." And then he was gone. Claire woke with a start, her body trembling as she sat up in bed. The apartment was silent, save for the soft sound of Ekko breathing at her side. She looked down at him, her heart aching, as she reached out to stroke his fur. In his amber eyes, she saw the faintest flicker of Ethan's soul, a reminder that their love, though tested by the boundaries of reality, would never truly fade. The air was thick with warmth and the heady scent of blooming jasmine, the kind of aroma that seemed to cling to the skin and stir the senses. Claire stood in the dreamlike meadow, her breath catching as the light of 100 stars bathed everything in a silvery glow. This place felt otherworldly, untouched by time or the rigid rules of reality. The grass beneath her feet was impossibly soft, the breeze whispering through the trees like a lover's caress. Everything about this space was alive, humming with energy, and at its center stood Ethan. He was exactly as she remembered him, strong, unyielding, and devastatingly familiar. His dark eyes smoldered as they met hers, and for a moment Claire forgot how to breathe. Every step he took toward her sent a ripple through the ground, through her, as if the universe itself acknowledged the force of his presence. He stopped just short of her, the space between them electric, crackling with unspoken words and unresolved longing. "You came back to me," she whispered, her voice trembling as tears filled her eyes. "I never left," he replied, his voice rich and steady, grounding her in a way nothing else could. "I've always been with you, Claire." She reached for him instinctively, her hands trembling as they found his chest. The warmth of him beneath her palms was startling, real in a way she hadn't dared to hope. His heartbeat thrummed steadily beneath her touch, anchoring her in this impossible moment. Ethan's hands rose to cradle her face, his calloused fingers brushing away the tears that spilled freely down her cheeks. "I thought I'd lost you," Claire murmured, her voice breaking. "I thought." "You could never lose me," Ethan interrupted, his tone fierce. "Not in life, not in death. You are my everything, Claire." The words ignited something deep within her, a heat that spread through her chest and down to her fingertips. It was as if her heart had been asleep, frozen in grief, and was now bursting to life in his presence. She surged forward, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pressed herself against him. The sensation was overwhelming, his scent, his warmth, the solidity of his body against hers. Ethan's arms encircled her, pulling her even closer. His grip was firm but tender, as if he were afraid she might vanish if he held too loosely. Their breaths mingled, the heat between them building until it felt as though the very air might combust. When his lips finally found hers, it was not a gentle reunion. It was a collision of desperation and longing, a release of all the emotions they had kept bottled up for so long. Claire gasped against his mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair as he deepened the kiss. He tasted of something familiar and intoxicating, a flavor she couldn't name but had missed more than she could bear. Her body responded instinctively, pressing closer, needing more, as though trying to make up for the time they had lost. Ethan's hands roamed her back, his touch leaving a trail of fire in its wake. The meadow around them seemed to respond to their passion, the glow of the stars intensifying, the breeze swirling around them like a living thing. Claire felt as though the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them and the burning connection they shared. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat echoing with the unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads pressed together as they clung to each other. Ethan's hands slid down to her waist, holding her firmly as his dark eyes searched hers. "I've missed you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every moment, every breath I've missed you more than words can say." Claire's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his tone. She cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing over his cheekbones as she memorized every detail of him. "I've missed you too," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "But it wasn't just missing you, it was like losing a piece of myself." "You didn't lose it," Ethan said, his lips curving into a faint smile. "It's always been here. You've always carried me with you." His words settled over her like a balm, soothing the jagged edges of her grief. She kissed him again, slower this time, savoring the feel of him, the way his hands tightened on her hips as though he couldn't bear to let her go. The heat between them flared once more, but this time it was tempered by something deeper, a love that burned steady and bright, unshaken by time or death. Ethan guided her down to the soft grass, his movements careful and reverent. He hovered above her for a moment, his eyes tracing her face as if committing it to memory. Claire reached up to touch his cheek, her heart swelling with a love so intense it left her breathless. "You're everything," she whispered, the words spilling from her lips without thought. "You always have been." Ethan's expression softened, and he leaned down to press a kiss to her forehead, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth. "And you're my forever," he murmured against her skin. "No matter where we are, no matter what happens, you're mine." The stars above seemed to explode in brilliance as they came together, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word was a reaffirmation of the bond they shared, a love that transcended the physical and burned with the force of the eternal. Time ceased to matter, the moments stretching and collapsing into one another as they lost themselves in each other. When they finally lay together, tangled in the softness of the grass, Claire felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Ethan's arms were wrapped securely around her, his chest rising and falling in time with hers. She rested her head against him, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his skin as she listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I don't want this to end," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan tightened his hold on her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It doesn't have to be said. Not here. Not now." Claire closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. For the first time in so long, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness, of a love that could withstand anything, even death. In Ethan's arms, she felt whole, complete, and utterly safe. And as she drifted into a contented sleep, she knew with unshakable certainty that their love would endure, no matter what lay ahead. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor of Claire's apartment. She sat cross-legged on the rug, her hand resting gently on Ekko's fur as he lay beside her, his golden eyes half closed in a quiet kind of contentment. The world outside was just waking, the sounds of the city muted by the glass panes. But within this room, time felt suspended, as though the universe had conspired to grant her a moment of peace. It had been weeks since the veil between worlds had opened, since Claire had touched Ethan in that dreamlike realm, felt the fire of his love once more. The memory of it was vivid, seared into her mind with a clarity that defied the passage of days. She could still feel the warmth of his hands, the way his voice had wrapped around her like a promise. But the reality of waking up without him had been its own kind of ache, a reminder that some distances could not yet be bridged. And yet she was not alone. Ekko had become her anchor in ways she couldn't explain. There was something about him, something more than his fierce loyalty, more than the uncanny way he seemed to understand her every word. It was in the way his presence calmed her, soothed the raw edges of her grief. It was in his eyes, those impossibly human eyes, that held a depth she could only describe as Ethan's. Claire reached for her cup of tea, her fingers brushing the warm ceramic as she sipped slowly. The room smelled of lavender and bergamot, a scent she had grown to associate with mornings like this. Ekko stirred beside her, lifting his head to rest it on her knee. She smiled down at him, her fingers absently scratching behind his ears. "You're not just a dog, are you?" she murmured, her voice soft. "You're so much more than that." Ekko didn't respond, of course. But there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a spark that made her breath catch. She set the tea aside and leaned closer, her hand moving to cup his face. "I don't know how this works," she said, her voice trembling. "But I know it's you, Ethan. I feel you in him. In the way he looks at me, the way he's always here when I need him." The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy. Ekko blinked slowly, his head pressing into her palm as if to confirm what she already knew. Claire's eyes filled with tears, her heart swelling with an ache that was both bittersweet and profound. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I miss your voice, your laugh, the way you used to hold me when the world felt like too much. But more than that, I miss the way you made me feel alive. Like I was more than just me." Ekko let out a soft whine, his head tilting in that familiar way that had always reminded her of Ethan. Claire laughed through her tears, the sound shaky but genuine. "You even worry like him," she said, stroking his fur. "Always trying to take care of me, even now." The days passed in a strange rhythm, a blend of quiet moments and sudden bursts of clarity. Claire began to find joy again, not the wild, unrestrained joy of her days with Ethan, but a quieter, steadier kind of happiness. She found it in the small things, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of birds singing outside her window, the way Ekko would nudge her hand when he sensed she needed comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Claire took Ekko for a walk through the park. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and earth. She let him lead, her thoughts wandering as her feet moved instinctively along the winding paths. They stopped at a small clearing, a place she and Ethan had discovered years ago. It was quiet here, the noise of the city muffled by the canopy of trees overhead. Claire sank onto a bench, her gaze fixed on the horizon as she let the memories wash over her. "This was our spot," she said softly, her fingers brushing Ekko's fur as he sat beside her. "Do you remember? We used to come here and talk about everything. Our plans, our dreams, all the things we thought we'd have forever to do." Ekko rested his head on her lap, his eyes closing as if to say, "Yes, I remember." Claire's heart ached, but it was a tender kind of pain, one that reminded her of how deeply she had loved and been loved in return. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Claire felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, a soft hum that vibrated through her chest and made her skin tingle. She closed her eyes, her breath steadying as the sensation grew stronger. It was the same feeling she had experienced the night she had seen Ethan in the otherworldly meadow, the unmistakable presence of something greater than herself. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you here?" The hum grew, enveloping her in a cocoon of warmth and light. Claire opened her eyes, and for a fleeting moment she saw him not as a ghost or a shadow, but as the man she had loved so fiercely. He stood just a few feet away, his dark eyes glowing with the same intensity she had fallen in love with. "I'm always here," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. Claire's breath caught, her heart pounding as she rose to her feet. "I don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Why can't you stay? Why can't we just be together?" Ethan's expression was tender, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Because this isn't our time," he said. "But that doesn't mean our love is any less real. It's eternal, Claire. It always has been, and it always will be." She reached for him, her fingers brushing against the edge of his form. It felt warm, solid, but it shimmered like light on water, intangible and fleeting. Ethan smiled, his hand ghosting over hers as if to reassure her. "You have a life to live," he said, "and I'll be with you in every moment of it. In the way the sun feels on your skin, in the quiet of the night, in the laughter you'll find again. I'm in all of it, Claire." Her tears fell freely now, but they were no longer born of despair. They were a release, a surrender to the truth she had always known but been too afraid to accept. "I'll never stop loving you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in it. "And I'll never stop loving you," Ethan replied. "You've given me more than I could have ever dreamed. And now it's time for you to give yourself that same love." The hum began to fade, and with it, Ethan's form grew fainter. Claire reached out one last time, her fingers brushing the air where he had been. The warmth lingered, wrapping around her like a promise. When the light finally disappeared, she was left alone in the clearing, the stars shining brightly overhead. Ekko sat beside her, his head resting on her knee, and she stroked his fur with a newfound sense of peace. "I understand now," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're with me, Ethan. In every step, in every breath. You're with me." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Claire smiled not because the pain was gone, but because she had learned to carry it with grace. Her love for Ethan was no longer a wound, but a part of her, a light that would guide her through whatever lay ahead. And with Ekko by her side, she knew she would never walk alone.